guys, this is going to be a recap of photosynthesis and just sort of an overview of the different steps of photosynthesis and the process and how it works. So, first of all, I think probably everyone's familiar with the concept that photosynthesis is the process that plants use to convert light energy into chemical energy, which is also known as sugar. So, here is our equation. First of all, I'm just going to label a few of these things. So we have our CO2, which is carbon dioxide, H2O, which obviously is water. This arrow, when we look at a chemical reaction, we haven't looked at one this year so far, but you probably did before in middle school. The arrow means yields or produces. And then you have oxygen gas on the other side, and glucose, which is C6H12O6. Glucose, which of course we know is sugar. Everything that's on the left side of the arrow is called a reactant. So all of these things are reactants. They will be used up in the process of photosynthesis. And all of the things on the right side of the arrow are called the products, which are produced or made or synthesized through the reactions. So every chemical reaction is going to have reactants and it's going to have products. And in photosynthesis, the reactants are your light energy, your carbon dioxide, and your water. And the products, or what's made, are going to be the oxygen and the glucose or the sugar. So all of the steps that I'm going to talk about in just a few minutes are going to be the processes that actually convert the reactants into the product. Okay. All right. So talk about some organisms that do photosynthesis. Obviously, I think all of you will be familiar with the concept that plants do photosynthesis. But there are also some bacteria, some protists, which protists are unicellular, usually freshwater organisms. That will do photosynthesis also. And then one example of a protist is algae, which was important for the case study that you guys have been working on with a coral. So we have a bunch of different organisms that complete this process. In order to complete this process, most of these organisms, except for the bacteria, are going to have a special organelle in their cells that's responsible for that. And this is kind of something we've already talked about before, but it is the chloroplast. I'm going to come down here. Chloroplast. And I'm going to say in eukaryotic cells. Because remember, prokaryotic cells don't have any organelles, and those are the bacteria. So we've looked at a chloroplast before, but we're now going to actually break down the different parts of the chloroplast because it's going to be important for each process of photosynthesis, which occurs in different parts. So first of all, you have this fluid in the outside of the chloroplast. That is called the stroma. And it's kind of just like the cytoplasm of the chloroplast. I'm just going to say that this is sort of like a gel inside the double membrane. You do have a double membrane in the chloroplast, which is why I have two lines going around the outside. Then you have these disc-like things. They look like stacks of rocks. Each of the little discs is called a thylakoid. So I'll just say that this is one disc. And then if you stack up a bunch of thylakoids, you create a granum, which is a stack of thylakoids. So I'll just highlight my vocab words there. Stroma is the gel, thylakoid is one of the discs, and a granum is a stack of thylakoids. If you have many stacks of thylakoids, they're called grana. That is the plural form of that. Okay, so now that we've talked about sort of the reaction overall, the organisms that do it, and the organelle that does it, we can start to talk about the actual steps of this process. And you might know from doing your case study that there are two main steps, which are the light dependent reactions and the light independent reactions. And there's a few different names for those things, which I'll talk about as we kind of go through it. So here we go. All right, so we're going to start with the light dependent reaction, which obviously is called that. Maybe it's not obvious, but it's called that because it depends on there being light. So first of all, the location of this is the thylakoid. Oops. Thylakoid. So the discs, each of the little discs is going to be completing this process or these processes. The light dependent reaction is going to use up a few of the things that were on our reactant. So it's going to use, first of all, light energy, which is why it's called light dependent. And it's also going to use up water, which the plant will have absorbed through its roots. So just an important thing to know is that plants are not absorbing water through their leaves. They're absorbing the water through their roots. So they're pulling it upwards using that cohesion and adhesion that we talked about before earlier this year to get the water to the leaves, which is where the photosynthesis actually happens. All right. So what actually happens in the light reactions? We're going to talk about this in terms of like some biochemistry and some atoms and some molecules and some electrons. So if I'm going to summarize it in the simplest terms, what happens is that photons, which are particles of light strike chlorophyll molecules, which the chlorophyll is what makes the plant actually green. It's a pigment. And what happens is that this causes, so I'll say causing electrons in chlorophyll to become excited. And that's literally what it's called, is the electrons becoming excited. So think about them like when you're excited, you're bouncing around and just like can't stop moving. And that's the same thing that's true about electrons. So when they're in their excited state, they just want to move. They want to bounce around. So what happens is the electrons pass from chlorophyll to chlorophyll molecule. I'll write that. Electrons pass from chlorophyll to chlorophyll. Eventually generating ATP, which of course is energy. And that's done, if you look at this picture over here, this molecule is called ATP synthase. It is an enzyme because it ends with ACE. And its job is actually to create ATP. So as the electrons pass, they generate enough kinetic energy, kind of similar to what we talked about with transport. They create like a gradient of energy. And then they actually create enough energy that they can create ATP by combining a phosphate group to an ADP. Basically, what you need to know is just that the electrons passing creates the energy that is then like trapped into ATP. Also, what happens with this light situation is that water is split. So I'll say this also results in the splitting. I'm going to actually move that because it doesn't look super easy to read. Splitting of water to form. If you split water, you get hydrogen ions and oxygen gas. And then just to help you with this picture, the membrane is the thylakoid membrane. So this right here is the thylakoid membrane. There are these big photosystems, they're just protein complexes that are embedded in the membrane of the thylakoid. So this down here would be side the thylakoid. This out here would be the stroma. You have these two different photosystems that are responsible for like containing the chlorophyll and doing this energy part. And then the electrons being passed results in ATP being generated and also water being split. So, in summary, we used up the light energy in the water to create excited electrons and to generate ATP and also to split up water. So, at the end of the day, what we've produced from these light reactions is oxygen gas, which will be released by the plant. I'll highlight oxygen. We also have produced ATP, which will be used up in the next step. One other thing is created, and this was in your case study, so I'm still going to mention it, and it's an electron carrier molecule that's called NADPH. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to say NADPH, which is an electron carrier that goes to the next step. So we've created these three things from the water and the light that we started with. Okay, ready for part two? Here we go. Okay, oops, down here, we're going to go to part two now, and there's a few different names for part two, which are the light independent reaction, the dark reaction, or the Calvin cycle. So you can call it any of those three things, and you might see it called any of those three things. The light independent reaction is called that because it does not require light in order to do it. So the location of our light independent reaction is the stroma, which is the fluid outside of the thylakoid. What's used up in this process is the ATP, which was produced by the light reaction. And also the NADPH, which also was produced by the light reaction. By light reaction. And the ATP is carrying energy and the NADPH is carrying electrons. So to summarize what happens, I didn't put a picture of this one on here because there aren't really any good pictures that show sort of what's happening. But what occurs is enzymes are used to modify and combine small, simple sugars. And also, I'll just say that this requires energy from ATP and electrons from NADPH to work. There are a ton of enzymes that are responsible for helping with this, but the main one that's kind of fun to say, so I'm going to tell you about it, is called Rubisco. And it's actually an acronym. So it's R, little u, big B, little I. I think it's a big S and then a CO. I don't even know what it stands for, but it's called Rubisco, and its job is to modify sugars. And the main sugar that it modifies is called RUBP, RuBP. But it's just an interesting fact. Okay, so this process produces, the only thing that it produces is glucose. It also, if you wanted to get really specific, like because it breaks down the ATP and the ADP, the NADPH, it produces ADP from ATP, which is the less energized version of ATP, and NADP plus, which is the version of NADPH that does not have an electron. But the main thing that's important is that it produces glucose. And that's step 2. Okay, so I'm going to do a little summary. Here I have my equation again, and I'm just going to make a note of like which step each of these things is either used or produced in. So my CO2 is used up in the Calvin cycle, which is the second part. So this is used in the Calvin cycle. And this is actually where the carbon for glucose actually comes from. So if you see here the carbon in CO2 and the carbon in glucose, so like the carbon that's in sugar at one point is actually in the atmosphere, in the air. It's a crazy thing to think about, but a true thing. And then, so let me say that the glucose, is produced in the Calvin cycle. And Calvin cycle is the same thing as light independent reaction or dark reaction. You can call them any of those things. And then what we have is our light reaction. So if you look at your, use a different color. Use blue. So my water and my sunlight are used up in the light dependent reaction. and my oxygen is produced in light dependent reaction. And then this is removed from the plant. The sugar is stored by the plant in roots or fruits, or it's used up using cellular respiration. And then the carbon dioxide comes from the atmosphere. We'll say absorbed from the air. The water is absorbed from the earth or the soil or the surroundings if it's a water plant. And the sunlight is absorbed by chlorophyll in the leaves. And then just a fact about why plants are green, because maybe you're wondering, is that chlorophyll actually reflects green light. And that's why you see green, because the green wavelength of light is being reflected. Now, what's like kind of crazy about this is that because green light is reflected by chlorophyll, if you put a plant under just a green light, it actually can't do photosynthesis because all of the light gets reflected back. So plants do the best photosynthesis actually under like either a red light or a blue light, which is crazy to think about that. You would think like green is the best, but it's not because it's getting reflected. This time of year in the fall, chlorophyll actually breaks down when the temperature is too cold. So that's what's happening now. And the other pigments in the plant are being revealed, which for some of them is yellow, some of them are more reds, but usually there's so much chlorophyll that it overpowers the other pigments that are there, which is amazing. So, timely thing about chlorophyll and fall. All right, just a few more summary things. I have this diagram here of the chloroplast that shows where step 1 happens and where step 2 happens. Step 2 I've done in my summary in yellow. So this is your, I'll call it Kelvin cycle. In the stroma, step 1 is the light dependent reaction. RXN is short for reaction. And I also just included this other like more scientific image that I did not draw down here in case you're a very visual person. It might be helpful just to see that the light reactions are happening in the thylakoids and the Calvin cycle is happening in the stroma. And then that ATP and the NADPH is being just constantly recycled over and over and over again all the time, which is amazing. So that's photosynthesis. I hope that you have learned something crazy and new about plants. And I'll see you next time for cellular respiration. Bye.